Rayquaza, the master of the Weather Trio, the originator of Mega Evolution, the ferocious final boss of multiple Pokémon games. Oh, and he's probably the strongest Pokémon ever made, too. So from Emerald to ZA, let's take a look at Rayquaza's impressive resume to see how it's one of the most influential Pokémon of all time, and how it almost kinda ruined Pokémon. Like most third version legendaries, Rayquaza is just kind of an Easter egg in Ruby and Sapphire, a hint of what's to come next. But unlike its predecessor Suicune from Pokemon Crystal, Rayquaza would have a direct relation to the first two box legendaries of the generation. With Generation 3 focusing on the theme of nature, naturally the three core legendaries would represent the land, sea, and sky, with each of them taking inspiration from creatures of Hebrew legends. Groudon is Behemoth, a monstrous beast that lives within the land. Kyogre is Leviathan, a powerful creature that rules the seas. And Rayquaza is Ziz, a massive bird that ruled the skies and could even block out the sun with its wingspan. If you've never heard of the last one, it's likely because Ziz's name is often lost in translation in the Bible, while Leviathan and Behemoth are not. Which is actually rather befitting of Rayquaza, who appears to be a much more unknown and mythical figure in Hoenn lore compared to Groudon and Kyogre, who are much more well-known. Design-wise though, it pulls more from the Aztec god known as the Quetzalcoatl, who was described as a flying serpent. Quetzalcoatl is also frequently depicted with the same green, yellow, and red color scheme that Rayquaza has as well. But returning to its actual role in the games, we first see what Rayquaza is really like in its featured game Pokémon Emerald, where Rayquaza descends upon Sootopolis City to quell the fighting between Groudon and Kyogre just as it did several million years ago. This is where some new lore from Pokemon Legends ZA actually comes in, as when Ansha tells the story of the Weather Trio's primal battle, she mentions that Mega Rayquaza actually has the power to take Groudon and Kyogre's primal powers away from them. There are a few other inconsistencies between Ansha's story in ZA and Zinnia's from Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. For one, Zinnia actually describes two separate battles happening between Groudon and Kyogre in the ancient past. The second one being 1,000 years later when they were reawakened by a surge of primal power coming from meteors striking the Earth. And in Zinnia's version of these events, it was the Draconid people's wish for Rayquaza to save them that caused it to Mega Evolve, as apparently Rayquaza didn't Mega Evolve the first time Groudon and Kyogre fought, which contradicts Ansha's story. Given that Ansha probably got her version of events from a storybook, I'm willing to bet that what she learned was just a condensed version of these events, where both battles were smushed together to make it easier to understand for literal babies and small children, because that's what Ansha is. With Zinnia being an actual lore keeper, I'm more inclined to agree with her version of the story. Speaking of lore keepers, my friend lorekeeper Toby actually just made a video about this potential retcon, which I highly recommend you check out if you want to learn more about it. He also has a great theory about how Hoenn's mythical Pokemon, Jirachi and Deoxys being from outer space, also fit into the Rayquaza lore, which is really fascinating. And speaking of Deoxys, its movie would be the next major appearance of Rayquaza, where Rayquaza once again appears to act as a protector of Earth, becoming rivals with Deoxys after it unintentionally intrudes on Rayquaza's territory, something that would go on to be a pillar of Rayquaza's identity throughout Pokemon lore. Rayquaza is kind of portrayed as a bad guy for most of the movie, but honestly, just like in the Groudon and Kyogre conflict from the games, he's just trying to protect the Earth. Think of him like Sky Zygarde, which is kind of funny given how these two overlap in ZA, but he's basically trying to contain the threats before they actually reach the Earth. In many ways, he's a personification of the ozone layer itself. And it was this instinct that granted Rayquaza the natural power to Mega Evolve, but we'll come back to that in a moment. For now, the main takeaway is that Rayquaza kinda ushered in the age of modern legendary Pokemon. Its role in Emerald not only redefined what the climax of a Pokemon game looked like with its cool cinematic scene. Hey, it was 2004, I know it doesn't look like much to you kids today, but these were otherworldly graphics when I was growing up. But also, Rayquaza, alongside Groudon and Kyogre, established a new power ceiling for legendary Pokemon. Yes, stat-wise they were still on par with Mewtwo from Gen 1, but with the advent of abilities, they reached heights that Pokemon from the first two generations could only dream of. And it's a big part of the reason why the Weather Trio are still so relevant today. They might just be the best aging legendary Pokemon in the series. Ironically though, as far as competitive battling went, in Gen 3 Rayquaza was strong, but nothing much more than a slightly better Salamence. It's a good Pokemon, don't get me wrong, but was frequently outshined by Gen 3's other legendaries, including Latias and Latios, who were absurdly busted with the Soldew. Rather, it was actually Generation 4 when Rayquaza started to silently turn into one of the strongest Pokemon in the Uber's metagame. Thanks to the physical special split, Rayquaza could finally take advantage of Dragon Dance to make Dragon Claw or Outrage hit even harder than they did in Gen 3. Or, if you wanted to run a special attacking Rayquaza, Draco Meteor now existed, which significantly improved its special move pool. Airlock also became a much more relevant ability as many bulky steel types tried to use Kyogre's Rain to protect themselves from fire moves, and it could shut down Pokemon like Kingdra who would rely on Swift Swim to sweep through teams of dragons. And in Gen 5, Rayquaza only got better, as it won a fan poll to receive V-Create as a special move. What in the world were they thinking? So Steel types who commonly countered Dragon were in even more trouble when matched up against Rayquaza. Because of Rayquaza's ever-expansive move pool, 150 in both attack and special attack, and an ability that negates weather effects, Rayquaza had no true counters outside of Pokemon who were forced to run Choice Scarf to outspeed it. And even then, KOing Rayquaza in one attack is exceptionally hard to do. It almost always had to be weakened first. This is another example of Rayquaza's great influence on Pokemon, as it was more than likely one of the leading reasons why Fairy-type Pokemon needed to be introduced. As by the time Black 2 and White 2 came out, Game Freak had already started development on Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, and they knew a huge buff was on the horizon for this already broken dragon. And something at least needed a sliver of a chance to stand up to it. As when Mega Rayquaza was introduced just a few short years later, it quickly became the most broken Pokemon of all time. As I alluded to earlier in its lore section, Rayquaza constantly devouring meteors to protect the Earth gave it the ability to Mega Evolve without a stone. Cool for the story, but devastating for competitive play. In-game, this is referred to as Rayquaza's Mikado organ, which, fun fact, Mikado is just another name for Emperor of Japan, which is quite fitting for this Pokemon. Just being able to reach a base stat total of 780, which ties Mewtwo's Mega Forms for the highest of all time, would be enough to make Rayquaza one of the greatest Pokemon ever. But the fact that it can do this while still having the option to hold a Life Orb or Choice Band, yikes! Not to mention all the other options that come with being able to hold an item. Lumberry meant that even burning it couldn't stop its rampage, and Roselli Berry meant that a Xerneas Moonblast wouldn't stop it. And bear in mind, this was long before open team sheets existed. This unpredictability factor made Mega Rayquaza the most versatile Mega Evolution ever made. On top of this, Mega Rayquaza was blessed with its own signature move in Gen 6, Dragon Ascent, which is ironically just Flying-type close combat, finally putting the cherry on top of Rayquaza's already oppressive moveset. Bear in mind, it still had V-Create from Gen 5. It was also given another signature ability, Delta Stream, which, like Airlock, negates the effects of weather, but also puts up a protective barrier around Rayquaza that cancels out its flying-type weaknesses. Meaning it's only weak to Fairy and Dragon, and while it's still weak to Ice, it's no longer the crippling double weakness it used to be. Even Primal Kyogre's Ice Beam was not enough to one-shot it. In singles, there was only one option to stop Mega Rayquaza. It became the first Pokemon to ever be banned from everything. Yeah, even Ubers wasn't a suitable playground for this thing. He's kind of like a 20-year-old man who pushes grade schoolers off the swing set. It's just bullying everything else for the love of the game. This prompted the creation of the Anything Goes tier, commonly just referred to as AG. Because it's a tier where basically all the rules are lifted. Because that's the only way you're ever going to beat Mega Rayquaza. Play with 6 Imposter Dittos if you want to, just anything to beat Mega Rayquaza. Yes, Zacian in Gen 8 and Miraidon and Calyrex Shadow Rider in Gen 9 would later go on to be occupants of the special tier as well, but never forget that Mega Rayquaza was the reason why it had to be made. It literally broke all the rules. In VGC, Mega Rayquaza was nearly equally as good, as it was the sole thing standing in the way of Primal Groudon and Primal Kyogre, who could dominate the meta with their weather-setting abilities. Man, how fitting that in both lore and competitive play, Rayquaza is the only answer to these two. It's almost hard to believe that Mega Rayquaza only won the World Championships once, being piloted by none other than some guy you may have heard of named Wolf Glick in 2016. But that's mostly because it was just straight up illegal in the 2017 and 2018 rule sets. While it got one last chance to shine in 2019, it only placed as high as 6th in that year's Worlds. But hey, Xerneas was also considered the strongest Pokemon ever for a time, and it never won Worlds, so anything can happen. Regardless, Mega Rayquaza is one of those Pokemon whose impact outlived its actual legality. As I noted before, Anything Goes is a tier that still remained in existence even after Mega Rayquaza's temporary retirement in Gen 8. And it proved that some Pokemon are just inherently game-breaking. It also transformed Ubers into more of an actual tier and less of just a ban list for Pokemon who were previously seen as overpowered. It established the precedent that some Pokemon are just too much for the game, even among the literal gods at the top, and made decisions to ban future overpowered Pokemon much easier in the process. I think it also proved to Game Freak that in some respects, power creep had gone a little too far. They thought about whether they could, but never stopped to think about if they should. Now yes, they still made some absolutely broken Pokemon post-Mega Rayquaza, I'm not arguing against that. Zacian Crowned in Gen 8 is an excellent example with its absurd stats and move pool, but even it's limited by having to hold an item to transform, and furthermore, Game Freak didn't allow it to Dynamax at all. It was almost like they said, alright, we got that out of our system, that's the upper limit, let's never do that again. Again, it hasn't stopped similarly broken Pokemon from over-centralizing the meta. I think if I see another Miraidon or Urshifu at Worlds next year, I'm gonna crash out. But no Pokemon has ever been truly as uncounterable as Mega Rayquaza at its peak. I know some may point at the newly introduced Mega Zygarde as an example of power creep gone too far, and yeah, those base 216 HP and special attack stats do look super scary. But bear in mind how much has to go right for Zygarde to even Mega Evolve. Unlike Rayquaza, it always keeps its double weakness to ice, it still has to hold a Mega Stone, and it has to hit half HP for it to even transform into its 100% form first. It's incredibly powerful, but you do have to jump through a couple of hoops to get there. You don't just press a button and win like with Mega Rayquaza. And that's assuming that they even legalize Mega Zygarde for competitive play first. We still have no idea how the rule sets in Pokemon Champions are going to look. Unfortunately, this has left regular Rayquaza in a bit of a void recently. The original Rayquaza now looks like a musket from the Revolutionary War. Sure, at the time, it was the pinnacle of combat technology, the new ceiling of power. But when the machine gun known as Mega Rayquaza raised the ceiling even further, even if it doesn't exist anymore, plenty of Pokemon now occupy that space of power between the two Rayquaza forms. Regardless, whether it's in the Pokemon world's lore, competitive play, or even just the final boss of ZA's DLC, it's clear that Mega Rayquaza was always envisioned as the most powerful Pokemon that Game Freak could possibly create. It's the prime example of what if a Pokemon actually kept its canon power in the actual battling gameplay. There's a reason why Dialga can't just freeze time mid-battle, and this is why. Maybe they'll prove me wrong in Gen 10, but for at least the last decade, this thing is the top dog in every respect. And, even taking OG Rayquaza into account, you could say this Pokemon has raised the bar more over the past 20 years than any other Pokemon has. In many respects, Rayquaza has truly changed the game. Before I go, just wanted to wish everybody a happy holiday season, and yes, as the sign behind me says, this is my 15th anniversary of making YouTube videos. My friends made that for me and threw a surprise party for me last weekend. They wanted that to be in at least one video background, so that's the context behind that. But just wanted to say that regardless of whether you've been here for 15 years or 15 minutes, I greatly appreciate the support, and thank you guys very much. I'll see you in 2026.